Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Claire Venuto, and I am the Acting Director of Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving at Rutgers University Camden. Thank you all for being with us today. This webinar is part of the Rutgers University Alumni Association's virtual event series, which offers Rutgers alumni and friends the opportunity to stay connected and hear from faculty members across the university. Today, we are honored to have with us Victoria Chase, Clinical Associate Professor at Rutgers Law School Camden and Director of the Domestic Violence Clinic, which represents survivors in domestic and sexual violence civil cases, as well as operates a statewide appellate project. Professor Chase teaches courses in evidence, family law, persuasion, disability law, and professional responsibility. She also co-teaches a prisoner reentry clinic, providing advice and counsel to returning citizens. Prior to joining the Rutgers Law faculty, Professor Chase was Executive Director of the Legal Clinic for the Disabled, a public interest nonprofit law firm providing legal services to people with disabilities. Based on her work with that organization, the Philadelphia Business Journal named Professor Chase to the 40 Under 40 list in 2004. Her diverse employment history includes working as an honors attorney with the U.S. Department of Transportation and as a commercial litigator. She has held several leadership roles at Rutgers Law, including the director of the Camden Law Clinic for more than 9 years and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. Professor Chase received the Dean's Award for Distinguished Service, the Chancellor's Award for Distinguished Service, and the Chancellor's Award for Teaching Excellence. She graduated cum laude from Rutgers Law School Camden in 1998. Please note, all attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of this discussion. If you have questions, please send them through the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Following the discussion, I will read your questions aloud to Professor Chase, and we will get to as many questions as possible. It is now my privilege to turn it over to Professor Chase.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to take in this webinar, whether you're taking it in today while it's happening or perhaps later on after it's been recorded. I'd like to begin by thanking the people at Alumni Engagement for all of their work in putting this together and their help and setting this up. These are wonderful opportunities for us to connect with our alums and our community in ways that we don't often get to while we're doing our regular routine of teaching and working with students and possibly attending conferences with other people who work in university settings. So this is a really amazing gift for us to have this opportunity. So I want to also say one more sort of thanks as I get started, which is I want to say thanks to the Rutgers community for supporting our work through Catalyst grants given out by the provost, formerly the provost, now the vice chancellor's office, because some of the work that I'm going to be discussing today has been supported by one of those grants, and it's wonderful to have opportunities to receive these, to receive support for our work from our home campus. Because a little goes a long way. So what this talk grows out of is really conversations that have happened over the course of the last several months, not so much concerning specifically the pandemic, but concerning really the relationship between law enforcement and domestic violence advocates and professionals when we face the calls to reform policing in the United States based upon many of the very terrible and tragic events that we've witnessed recently. And many domestic violence professionals support anti-racist initiatives and are sympathetic, more than sympathetic, calls to reform policing and police activity. At the same time that we are sympathetic to these calls and support the anti-racist agenda, we also recognize that our work is deeply connected to law enforcement. Since the 1970s, work in the domestic violence field has been largely supported by grant initiatives and other initiatives that bring together really the criminal justice side, criminal justice practices, with all of the other forms of relief that we try to provide to people that are experiencing domestic violence, with criminal justice initiatives and the strength and force of the criminal justice system really being the driving force in how we have defined domestic violence response in the United States. And so it's very challenging because our loyalties to law enforcement have been challenged by this conversation, as well as our, the modes that what we rely upon, the modes we rely upon to ensure victim safety. A lot of those modalities are really modalities that are presently located in the criminal justice system. So as we move forward in these conversations, I think it is important for all of us who are domestic violence professionals to be mindful about our, sort of our existing strategies, to be creative in terms of thinking about strategies for the future and directions that we may go. And when we think and talk about the possibility of reforming policing in the US, to not lose sight of the fact that a significant component of policing relates to domestic violence response. So I'm going to begin a screen share of a PowerPoint presentation concerning some of these things and share some data to shed some light on some of these observations and invite people to a mindset around thinking creatively as we move forward as to how this future that we may begin pursuing in the next few months as we see a change in leadership and our energy shift, and we can begin thinking about the agendas for reform that we have been prompted to pay attention to over the last couple of months. Okay, so here are some of the key considerations that I want people to be able to take away from this talk. The first is that I want people to be able to reflect upon the connection between New Jersey domestic violence response measures and law enforcement activity in our state. I also want us to be thinking about how domestic violence response should figure into enforcement priorities and the specialization, training, and funding of police officers and police forces, and what work we should be doing to assess this question, and to be thinking about, well, what is it that really we think policing could or should look like if it continues into the future, and what role should thinking about domestic violence work play in that thinking. And then finally, how can we domestic violence professionals go about developing some fresh ideas to augment existing domestic violence response measures, as the data really seems to be indicating that the success of many of our response measures has flattened to some extent. Okay, so gender-related violence remains a persistent global problem, an enormous global problem. And the data that has been put together by the UN recently indicates that the problem on an international scale is very similar to the problem in the US. And there's been several different reports relying upon homicide data, because homicide data tends to be relatively more robust than other forms of data concerning violence and violent activities and gender-related violence. And what the data tells us is that 58% of female homicide victims globally were killed by an intimate partner or family member in 2017, and that this represented an 11% increase over similar data that was collected in 2012, and that women are victims internationally, and about 82% of intimate partner homicides versus men who are victims in about 18% of those similar cases. And in the US, despite the fact that between 1993 and 2010, studies that were done by the United States Department of Justice indicated an enormous decrease in domestic violence activity and in domestic violence offenses, a decrease of about 54%. More recent data studying homicide reports demonstrates that there was a 19% increase in intimate partner homicide between 2014 and 2017. And this uptick is some cause for concern that we have not been as successful as we hoped that we were in really addressing this particular challenge. The Center for Disease Control and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence collect a lot of data, and that data tells us that the picture remains fairly concerning for women in the United States. 1 in 3 female murder victims are killed by an intimate partner versus 1 in 20 for males. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 men are likely to experience and report intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And that victims of intimate partner violence lose a total of 8 million days of work per year. And intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crime according to national data collected by the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. In terms of what we see happening in our state, in New Jersey, well, the New Jersey data reveals that in 2016, we saw a jump in domestic violence offenses. It increased about 3% up to about 63,420 as reported by New Jersey State Police in that year. And then over the last several years for which data is available, we've seen that number taper back down slightly again, 61,295 in 2017, 60,130 in 2018, and 59,645 in 2019. So we did see a jump that was consistent with some of the data that we mentioned earlier, but then we see some tapering off. Something else that we can look at to get some insight into what's going on in terms of how domestic violence factors into policing in New Jersey and what our numbers look like is we can look at police call-outs in New Jersey. And this data is available to us on a county by county basis for years up and through 2016. So the Domestic Violence Clinic has been reviewing data from 2006 to 2016. And over this 10-year period, what we can tell you is that domestic violence call-outs account for about 18 to 21% of all police call-outs. So roughly 1/5 of all police call-outs over this 10-year period related to domestic violence. The other things that we can sort of tell is that there's great variation in the rates of call-outs county to county, which is not terrifically surprising for all of us who live in the state and recognize that the counties have very different characters and experience very different challenges. But for each county over that 10-year period, it's reasonably consistent. And I want to mention also that in looking at this data, I've excluded consideration of 2007 because 2007 actually indicated a sort of an anomaly where the data for police callouts was much higher with respect to DV incidents than normal. And in that year, 33% of all callouts were recorded as DV callouts. And so I've excluded it given the possibility that there may be some anomaly in how that data was recorded. But this gives us some insight that when it comes to what police are really doing in the state of New Jersey, that a significant amount of their time is devoted to responding to the problem of domestic violence. And when we think about what we want law enforcement to be doing, one of the things that we probably can all agree we want law enforcement to be doing is we want there to be a reliable, fast, robust, and safe response, and a fast response as well, when there are domestic violence incidents and there's a call to 911, by someone seeking help directly for themselves or by someone else calling, seeking to get some first responder intervention in an ongoing problem. And so when you look at it this way, you can say, well, really shouldn't domestic violence be one of the primary things that we're thinking about in terms of law enforcement training and specialization and behavior in relationship to the overall composition of what we're expecting law enforcement to do. And here's one of these areas where I think in the state of New Jersey, we really need to be studying, well, in addition to domestic violence, what are some of these other key areas where we do want law enforcement to be acting and that do account for a significant component of their work. Because in many ways, the way that the law enforcement agenda and response has been organized, domestic violence is a tag on to sort of a set of existing practices and policies that law enforcement engages in. And so let's take a look at the relationship between domestic violence and law enforcement. Okay, so federal funding institutionalizes criminal justice responses and supports separation policies as being a means of addressing abuse around our country. And we have two major federal funding sources and several other smaller funding sources. that funnel money into states to operate programs, including, perhaps most importantly, and most specifically, law enforcement programs, as well as funding civil legal services, shelter, and counseling for people that are experiencing domestic violence. And this funding supports the creation, implementation, and strengthening of policies in the states that are designed to do things like develop and implement mandatory and preferred arrest statutes where domestic violence is a problem, mandatory and encouraged prosecution practices, law enforcement training, enhanced sentencing and penalties for domestic violence incidents, legal services for quasi-criminal civil relief, like civil protective orders, which I'll talk about in a moment, temporary shelter, and then counseling. And we can see that what funding is funneled into is a response that both heavily favors an agenda that criminalizes domestic violence, as well as an agenda that favors policies that support separation. States receive this money and then implement these programs, and then also funnel funding into smaller community-based programs that deliver services directly to the affected populations. Okay, and some of the criminal justice measures that are supported through this funding, as you can see, there are many. They include things like, well, the creation of domestic violence specific crimes and amendments to existing statutes, the criminalization of violation of civil protective orders, mandatory arrest or arrest of primary aggressor, and law enforcement training, amongst other things. There are civil justice measures that are also supported by the funding, though that you will see that they tend to be a bit more finite. They include civil protective orders, and then there are other civil justice remedies that states may implement or rely upon, which might include tort or other family law remedies. And then we've seen the proliferation to some extent of other reliefs in the civil sector, including, the extension of TANF or welfare benefits for people who have experienced domestic violence, some protections with respect to unemployment, and housing benefits as well. So civil protective orders are one of the main forms of civil legal relief, and civil protective orders really work in, I want to say, in cooperation with criminal justice measures. And the reason why those civil protective orders work in cooperation with criminal justice measures is because these are essentially stay-away orders that are issued using a civil burden of proof or preponderance of the evidence. They're issued to the particular individual that has been harmed, who is what we call the survivor or the victim. And typically the penalty for the violation of the stay-away order is incarceration, right? So it involves a criminal justice penalty for the violation of these civil orders. And so you can see that civil orders and other criminal justice measures sort of work hand in hand. And so from this funding, we begin to get a relatively complete picture of how deeply interconnected domestic violence response and law enforcement measures have become in the United States. In fact, it's really difficult to think about the US response to domestic violence without first leaping to the legal response, which is largely a criminal response because of the influence of these funding measures. Many people in my field trace this sort of, interrelationship between criminal justice measures and domestic violence response back to some policy decisions in the 1970s that reflected sort of a very clear bargain between people that were advocating about domestic violence reforms and the importance of police response and the importance of changing police practices and norms around, sort of hands off in some of these instances. And so what's resulted in, and is really, I would say, a deep-seated interconnection between law enforcement and between domestic violence response. And so when we talk about, well, let's defund police, or let's change policing practices, or perhaps criminal justice abolition, we're talking about also drastic transformation of our response to the problem of domestic violence. And we're also, really, I think, talking about destabilizing certain loyalties, political loyalties between people who have been very invested in domestic violence response and then people who also are very invested in criminal justice response. And the overall implication is, and I think for many in the field might agree, that it's very difficult to think creatively and to get funding for other strategies. that might be beneficial to victims of domestic violence into addressing the problem. All right, so as we move forward and as we think about this opportunity that we have right now to rethink what we're doing in a really holistic and important way, to both rethink not only policing, but also rethink domestic violence work, we shouldn't lose sight of what's been successful about the US response, right? And there are many things that have been successful and significant about the US response. And when you look at UN materials that urge other countries to take certain measures, some of these measures are reflected in what the UN is urging other countries to do. Now, I have a whole set of opinions about how you should evaluate when you're thinking about, transforming an agenda, what's going on in a country that might be different than your own. But looking at what has been successful and why is a key and important aspect of this process. So there definitely is changing norms. Norms have been affected by both criminal and civil legal responses. And we have absolutely been able to effectuate change with respect to mobilizing police forces and police responses. I will not say that that has been a perfect mobilization process, but it absolutely is one that can be demonstrated by changes in police practices around the country, and particularly here in New Jersey. We have held many batterers accountable, although certainly there have been instances where batterers have not been held accountable through the criminal justice system, and victims have faced, gender-related discrimination in the justice system. And we've, impacted public attitudes about the problem. And we've provided a forum for addressing and developing our understanding of the dynamics of abuse, by developing law further to reflect what we understand now to be significant concerns. It might have been behavior that would have been ignored in the past, such as strangulation, where chokeholds and things like that might have been ignored in the past, but now we really pay attention to it. And then, our ongoing and developing understanding of the dynamics of abuse, and how technology is changing, how what tools are available to abusers when they want to surveil someone or be tracking their behavior. And then, we do know that voluntary compliance with law is a significant aspect of the success of our response. Many abusers do voluntarily comply with orders of protection, and that is a significant enhancement to the safety of the individuals who hold those orders. And then we have the development of responsive networks and empowerment and validation, which is possible through some of the court processes and other processes that are available. But there's also a lot of challenges, right? There's been a lot of challenges raised to our existing practices. And I think it's really important that we spend some time and attention on these challenges as we move forward, right? Separation, abuse, and the escalation of abuse at times of separation is a verifiable phenomena and raises concern that an agenda that is rooted in separation as being a primary means of response ignores this really incredibly significant period of vulnerability for survivors. Criminal prosecution frequently clashes with victim interests, right? Lots of times our survivors don't want criminal prosecution for the person who has harmed them. Consider, for instance, the circumstances that many parents in the state of New Jersey experience when their adult children experience drug addiction and may be engaging in abusive or harassing behaviors to their parents in an attempt to extract funds to feed their addiction. They're not interested in having their children criminalized, but they would be interested in health-related responses or other responses to try to address some of these needs. We also see the problem of dual arrest. Someone who really we might be thinking has been a long-term survivor of domestic violence is vulnerable to arrest if they fought back or defended themselves, and they live in a state like New Jersey where there is a statutory provision for mandatory arrest where there's any visible sign of injury. Imagine that someone scratches someone who has harmed them in self-defense. Well, that scratch would be a visible sign of injury that could lead to them becoming arrested, and that does happen. And we also are aware of routine complaints that court processes are not victim friendly, they are not trauma informed, and that courts routinely re-traumatize survivors. And there's been really, I think, a failure to establish access to reliable, better treatment protocols. There are more critiques as well, 2 more slides to be precise, but plenty of them, and probably more than I'm even going to cover here. There are effectiveness critiques that have been leveled at our domestic violence responses. We're not really particularly effective, even at criminal prosecution for non-extreme offenses. Lots of times those offenses are negotiated out or plea bargained out, or not even there's no action taken at all if they're in municipal courts. And there's really no accountability in our framework, and there's no services associated with people who may have engaged in those behaviors. It just goes away. There's really a lack of accountability for prosecutorial discretion and what happens in these cases. Take, for instance, cases that involve intimate partner sexual assault, right? How do we hold prosecutors accountable and ask them to take action when appropriate on those cases, right? Further, what should the standard be when prosecutors have a complaining witness that doesn't agree with prosecutorial decision-making in a case, right? How should we be addressing those sorts of disagreements when they occur? There are particularly enforcement concerns. If you have a restraining order, what good is it if the police don't come if you call? Or if there's a delay, what are we really doing about enforcement? And then finally, stagnation. We've seen in the numbers that this relative consistency year to year in terms of rates of domestic violence should lead us to be concerned, right? That we're really seeing, we saw some benefits in the beginning, but those benefits appear to be stagnating overall. And then we've got a lot of resource inadequacy that we see with respect to our current agenda, right? We don't have enough housing for people to be able to effectively leave an abusive partner. We don't have enough funding or options for PTSD treatment. We don't have adequate access to legal services, although I understand that recently New Jersey has increased access to VCCO funding for legal services associated with domestic violence, which is a good thing, but it remains to be seen, how much of the, that number of people that are proceeding through the legal system without representation, how many of them that will actually manage to deliver representation to. And then we've got inadequate resources for supervised parenting time where it's warranted. And really, batterers are not getting much consideration at all. We don't have an effective public health agenda associated with addressing batterer behavior, right? With trying to help their circumstances improve. And we can see that this is very different than the agenda in other countries where there is more attention paid to healing and forward momentum for batterers, right? And economic supports for batterers who may need that in order to address some of their issues. So there are some efforts that are different that are happening right now in the United States that are, I think, the implementation to some extent of some protocols that have been effective in other locations around the globe. And in general, I would advocate that we should be looking to other countries to see what they are experimenting with and what's been successful. We do have an increased attention to prevention strategies relying on education, and a lot of these strategies are particularly targeted to men and teens because of the gendered nature of the problem as it continues to persist. We do have research and supporting the development of better batterer treatment protocols. We do have some conversations beginning about, well, what options are there for survivors beyond criminal justice remedies and our CPO process, a civil protective order process, which still has this, flavor of criminal justice response about it. So we see some attention being paid to restorative justice and transformative justice practices, but really no clear avenues for implementation or competitive or ways that we are making this a realistic competitive alternative to criminal justice system activity. So that's something that even though the conversation is there, I don't know that we're really taking steps in that direction yet. And we're seeing some attention being paid to, the extreme need to limit access to firearms for people where there are known challenges and issues. But we have a lot of obstacles, and those obstacles were obstacles that came through in the conversations that I was participating in last summer. These obstacles include things like, loyalty to our law enforcement partners who really, we rely upon them to continue doing the work that we need them to do to be first responders in relationship to domestic violence. And this is what the pandemic brought home. When the courts closed, the only people that were available to respond to issues of domestic violence, to facilitate the issuance of civil protective orders, and to do anything at all were law enforcement officers. So it was made very clear to us, and there's been some, news reporting on the increase in calls to police and to police facilitated filings for civil protective orders in the state of New Jersey in light of the pandemic. The other thing is that safety, many of us feel that safety still is an unrealized priority, right? And so the law enforcement agenda as it currently stands still needs work to get safety to be, to be realized more routinely, and to get courts and others to be paying attention to the extreme needs of our population. There's a certain amount of orthodoxy, right? This is the way we've done it. This is the way we should do it always. And there's certain power in that. And there's political pressures to maintain established practices, because these practices fund services all around the state and fund institutions that provide very valuable services. And then I think, when we think about alternatives, we always recognize that if we're thinking about things that look like public health initiatives, well, we've experienced a lot of difficulty in getting successful public health initiatives off the ground in various arenas. And so we want to think carefully about, well, what would we be trading in for if we did that? So some serious obstacles. And so I want to close with some thoughts about where we might go from here, and invite your questions, and thank you for your time and attention. Number one, I think economic support for families with housing a priority is something that we need to make sure remains part of our agenda moving forward, and that we don't lose sight of that as we're thinking about process-based options that address situations between an abusive party and an abused party. Further, we've got to continue focusing on trauma and treatment as equally important to the legal system and to law enforcement, right? And maybe even a priority over. What if we were to say that a person ought to be healthy and to be treated and given some PTSD treatment before they were asked to participate in law enforcement activities, right? There's delays all the time in law enforcement activity. And you could imagine a world in which someone had access to treatment, could both promote their ability to participate in law enforcement activity, but just promote their ability to navigate, rather than prioritizing law enforcement and civil court processes, which frankly have the effect of re-traumatizing them. And then we could have more attention being paid to what's going on with the roles of lawyers and social workers in addressing these issues, right? There's a lot of siloism going on, right, where we operate separately, and lawyers, have this card of control when it comes to court processes, and social workers can feel very frustrated and relegated about this, whereas they're also on the front line in most instances. And so, there's some work we have to do about, figuring out how to do a better job of partnering. And then we need more increased transparency and data collection concerning the effectiveness of existing legal remedies, the availability of existing legal remedies, and the opportunity for alternatives. And so with that, I'm going to close my comments and invite your questions. And once again, say thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much for speaking today, Professor Chase. We do have 2 questions that were submitted through the registration form, and then we have additional questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to begin with the questions submitted through the registration form. We have someone who says, I work in the child sexual abuse field. Are there any updates with CSA and the criminal justice system?
Any updates with the
CSA
and the criminal justice system? Okay, in the child abuse field?
I think that's what we're to assume. Yeah, CSA.
Yeah, so I am not a specialist in child abuse and neglect. I work with Professor Meredith Shalick and Professor Ann Friedman, both of whom spend a lot of time and energy actually working in that field. I'm a little concerned, right, that to some extent the child welfare system is in fact, one of the systems that is most relevant to criminal justice critiques, because we tend to behave in the child welfare system with a mindset that is very influenced by racist practices. And I think we've got to be very mindful of that moving forward. So I would say that some of the same things that we're talking about today would apply there, and that around the country right now, scholars are interested in this question of what should we be doing differently with respect to the child welfare system, and is the child welfare system one of the systems that, if we were to abolish policing, should also be abolished? And there are many that are advocating that that is true. But with respect to specific reforms or changes that are on the table right now, I really couldn't say.
Okay, the next question has a little bit of shorthand, so I'm going to do my best to read it out.
Okay.
The person asked, are safety and accountability audits developed by Ellen Pence, pushed by the NIJ in early 2000s, being used to examine and improve victim flow through multi-system?
To my knowledge, to my knowledge, not in our state. Okay, so in our state, we don't really continue. We haven't been engaged. We've talked about bringing in some of these tools, but have not been able to implement this on any sort of widespread scale.
Thank you. Another attendee says, I was under the assumption violation of civil protection orders did not result in incarceration, and that this was how it was different than restraining orders.
So, okay, so that's a question that I think is just a simple sort of, getting specific about terms. Civil protective order is the term that we use on a national basis to describe a restraining order. So in the state of New Jersey, we call a domestic violence restraining order issued pursuant to the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act a final restraining order, or in its initial phase, a temporary restraining order, or a final domestic violence restraining order. Those final restraining orders are enforceable by a period of incarceration by 30 days as of the second prosecuted offense. Civil restraints are what we say when we are referring to two people that have agreed to a dismissal of a restraining order case, and they're also agreeing to stay away provisions. And those stay away provisions may become part of like a child custody case or a divorce case between the two of them, where they're agreeing, often mutually, although not necessarily, not to have contact with each other. Civil restraints are not criminally enforceable. Final restraining orders are, and final restraining orders are a type of civil protective order. It's what we in New Jersey call what other states would call potentially a civil protective order. So when I use the term CPO or civil protective order, I'm not referring to a civil restraint in New Jersey. I'm referring to a final restraining order. So really just a terminology issue.
Someone asked, does the data support the notion of a backlash of IPV homicide with the criminalization of DV response? If so, how can we move forward or target special cases?
What the data supports, what the data seems to support, and I do think that further work absolutely needs to be done to unpack what the data means, because frankly, we're not really even talking about the data very much in DV circles at the moment. But what the data seems to support is that in the last couple of years, studies of homicide data around the globe showed an uptick, right? There was an uptick. Now, is that a backlash response? Could we say that that's a cause and effect? Because I would say perhaps not. And the reason why I would say perhaps not is because the data also reflected a sort of similarity to violent crime and homicide activity generally, right? What some of the UN data points out, and this is global data, is interestingly actually that in countries that it seems as if actually what tends to happen is that femicide remains relatively flat despite other changes in homicide data and violent crime data. And so it's hard to draw conclusions about the relationship between crimes against women as intimate partners and other forms of criminal activity. And it's hard to assess effectiveness of existing measures, because even when you have places where rates of crime are very low, you tend to see, like I said, this flatness, right, to with respect to femicide data. I find this UN data really interesting. And when you correlate it to the US data, I think I didn't expect to see the same uptick over a similar period in the US data, but lo and behold, there it was in the study that showed that between 2014 and 2017, we had an uptick, right? We'd seen a decrease for a long period of time, and then we saw an uptick. Based upon the time in which it's happening, I wouldn't characterize that necessarily as a backlash, but I would say, well, it's concerning and it communicates something to us. And it may communicate to us that we need to question whether or not we've done everything we could to address the problem.
There's a question about data. Is this data inclusive of domestic violence incidents against men in relationships as well, or are both sexes lumped together?
Okay, so some of the data, as you saw with the CDC and the NCADV data, is gender specific or sex specific, and typically is divided into males and females, and it's like readily available form, and so not necessarily responsive to our current thinking about transgender populations and how that could be factored in. But more recent data that is now being collected is more responsive that and does provide opportunities for reporting that. So I assume that over the next couple of years, we'll see some variation as to that particular data. When it comes to arrest records in New Jersey, which is some of the data that I was looking at, that is not gender specific. That is not divided by males and females, at least not in the way in which we've analyzed it yet, though that certainly is going to be the next thing that I do. What we generally tend to carry as an assumption with us when we're looking at this data, and it seems, and because in all of the years that I've been teaching the DV clinic since 2004, it's remained a relatively consistent assumption, is that roughly 25% of the people who are identified one way or another as a survivor of domestic violence or victim of domestic violence are males, meaning that 75% are usually females. And so we've seen that to be a relatively consistent statistic that sort of informs our thinking most of the time. But absolutely, now that the question has come through, that's going to be the next thing I go and look at in terms of the arrest data, really the call out and arrest data.
And we have one more question, and this attendee asks, are you aware of any transformative justice programs in our area or Philadelphia? I tried searching and found most were on the West Coast.
Yeah, so Professor Friedman and I, my colleague and friend, and a person to whom I owe a great debt of gratitude because she was one of my professors when I was in law school, and now she is my co-teacher in one of the clinics that I teach. She and I are teaching for the first time this spring a transformative justice course, which covers restorative justice as well as other transformative practices. At the law school, it is our hope to grow both travel study opportunities related to this so that people can experience what's going on in other places. There are programs, for instance, on the East Coast, I'll mention those in a moment, and then on the West Coast. And then frankly, there's programs that are really functional in other countries that we could be learning from. And so we're hoping that we're able to develop more robust practices here, and perhaps even a clinic here at Rutgers Camden to do this work related to our DV and returning citizen work, as well as to other forms of other areas where transformative practices could be helpful. I just want to say though, okay, so if you're looking for information about programs and practices, sometimes terminology is not your friend yet once again, because they go by different names. So if you look at Credible Messenger out of New York City, which you'll find lots of references to and opportunities to get involved in what they do. And if you look at Unitive Justice out of Richmond, these two options that you could see. And then we have people who are interested possibly out of Rutgers, New Brunswick, who might also have resources to provide. But we're really excited about the possibility of the work that we're going to be doing and founding it here. And would love to hear from people about their interest as we get this ball moving forward at Rutgers Camden.
Great, so that was the last question.
That was not, I don't think that was a planned question, but man, I couldn't have asked for a better question with that one.
Yes, a good one to end on. If there's anything you wish to share with the audience regarding the domestic violence clinic, or perhaps if they're interested in becoming involved or hearing more about what you just mentioned, I want to give you the opportunity to give that another plug.
Oh, so the domestic violence clinic, so, Rutgers Camden has been doing domestic violence work since 1995, meaning that we've been heavily partnered with the court system. We've been partnered with other agencies, and we're presently, through the clinic, partnered statewide with all of the agencies that provide legal services around domestic violence. We're also incredibly thrilled that one of our partner entities, the Rutgers Law Associates, is also affiliated with doing domestic violence work through the Rutgers Crime Victims Agency. I forget, I'd have to check that specific name, but they have a location in the law school, actually in Camden, as well as in the law school in Newark. And so we're incredibly thrilled to be a part of this network. And our students will be in the DV clinic again this spring, handling trials, handling appeals. We have a statewide appellate project in addition to doing local trial cases, doing Zoom trials because they're moving forward right now, even though there's a pandemic. And so, we're proud to be continuing, to do this work and to be engaged as we are on a statewide basis with so many partner agencies and to have to share what we do. We're also really, excited about this opportunity to think about, well, what could restorative practices offer people who are survivors in the state of New Jersey? How could we do things differently? We have a wonderfully responsive judiciary. We have a wonderfully responsive bar in New Jersey. And if any state could get some really interesting stuff off the ground, I think we are well positioned to do it. So, Professor Friedman and I are looking forward to creating an anchor here in Rutgers Camden for restorative work next semester. And I'm certainly open to hearing from anybody that has an interest. I don't know how we will incorporate the community quite yet, but certainly that incorporating the community is a priority for all Rutgers Camden educational initiatives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us and your excitement for the project as well. Thank you, everybody, for giving us some of your time this afternoon. We will be following up this presentation with an email, and we'll be sharing this recorded webinar with you in the next week or two. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you again, Professor Chase.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.